Ever wonder what happens to all those highly trained military and police officers in the Philippines once they retire?
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, these folks have dedicated their lives to service. They're not exactly the type to just kick back and relax, are they?
I wouldn't think so, no.
So today we're going to take a deep dive into some research that explores this very question. And trust me, the results are surprising. We're talking about military and police officers transitioning into powerful civilian government roles, cabinet positions, Senate runs, you name it. One even went on to become president.
Wow. Real
Yeah. So this research paper we're diving into analyzes this fascinating trend in the Philippines, and it reveals a pretty striking statistic. Between 1987 and 2022, a whopping 32 former military and police officers served as cabinet secretaries.
3-2.
That's a pretty significant number, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's quite a few.
Now, while some of these appointments seem like a natural fit, with their expertise aligning with the departments they lead, others, well, let's just say they raise some eyebrows and make you wonder about the motivations and implications of these career jumps.
Yeah, I could see that.
Makes you wonder if there's something more to it than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
So to help us make sense of all of this, the researchers use something called Schlesinger's ambition theory to categorize these post-retirement career paths.
Schlesinger's ambition theory.
Yep.
It sounds pretty academic.
It is a bit, but stick with me.
Okay.
Think of it as a framework for understanding the different types of ambition that drive these individuals.
Okay, so like what makes them tick after they hang up their uniforms?
Exactly. So like a way to decode their career moves.
I like it. Career decoder ring.
That's a great way to put it. So let's break down this ambition theory. What are these different categories and how do they play out in real life?
All right, lay it on me.
Okay, so the first category is what Schlesinger called discrete ambition. This applies to individuals who are content with holding a single-term office and then gracefully bowing out, embracing full retirement. They've served their time, made their contribution, and are ready to move on to other pursuits. They're not looking to climb any higher on the political ladder.
So they're like one and done, public service mission accomplished, and on to the next chapter.
You got it. Okay, so next up we have static ambition. Picture those cabinet members who are the steady hands, the reliable veterans. They might serve in multiple cabinet positions, sometimes even across different administrations, but they're content to stay at that level, offering their expertise and experience. Think of it like being a utility player on a baseball team. They can handle different positions, but choose to remain within that team structure.
So they've found their niche and they're sticking with it, even if it means switching departments.
Exactly. They're the institutional memory, the steady hand on the wheel.
Okay, makes sense.
But what about those with, well, a bit more drive, shall we say?
You mean the ones gunning for the top spot?
Exactly. Those would fall under what Schlesinger called progressive ambition. These individuals see their cabinet position as a stepping stone, a launching pad for higher office.
They're playing the long game.
They are. They've got their sights set on becoming senators, congressmen, or maybe even president.
Wow, so it's like they're moving strategically across the chessboard, always aiming for that checkmate.
That's a perfect analogy. They're ambitious, driven, and they see the bigger picture. Now, last but not least, we've got the fourth category.
Hit me with it.
It's called intrainstitutional ambition.
Intrainstitutional ambition. Okay.
Yeah, this one's a bit different. It applies to those who aren't necessarily looking to climb to a whole new level, but are focused on gaining influence and power within the existing government structure.
So not necessarily aiming for the spotlight,
Yeah.
but more about mastering the inner workings of the system.
You got it. Think of someone who aspires to become executive secretary, a position that doesn't have the same public profile as a senator, but wields immense power behind the scenes.
Pulling the levers from within.
Exactly. They're the master strategists, the ones who know how to get things done within the system.
So we've got our 4 ambition archetypes, right?
We do. And the research paper dives into specific cases from each presidential administration, starting with Corazon Aquino and going all the way to Rodrigo Duterte. It's filled with fascinating examples, like Fidel Ramos, for instance. He served as defense secretary under President Aquino and then went on to win the presidency himself.
Wow. So he used that cabinet position as a springboard.
He did. Talk about progressive ambition in its purest form.
Makes you think, does having that military background give someone an edge in a presidential race?
Right. Is there a certain level of trust or authority associated with it? It's definitely a question worth pondering.
Definitely adds another layer to this whole ambition thing.
It does. Okay, so another compelling case is Renato de Villa. He served as defense secretary under both Corazon Aquino and Fidel Ramos. He held several cabinet positions before eventually running for president himself.
Interesting. So his path wasn't so straightforward.
Not at all. It actually suggests a potential shift in ambition. He seemed content at the cabinet level for a while, demonstrating that static ambition. But then that presidential bid indicates a move towards intra-institutional ambition, wanting to lead from the very top of the existing system.
It's like he was reassessing his goals along the way, figuring out how to leverage his experience.
Exactly. It shows how these ambitions aren't always fixed. They can evolve over time as circumstances change and opportunities arise.
Makes sense.
So let's talk static ambition. Are there any individuals who really exemplify that commitment to serving at the cabinet level, even across multiple administrations?
Give me some names.
Okay, how about Eduardo Ermita and Hermogenes Ebdane Jr.? These individuals were reappointed time and again, serving in different departments and across different administrations. They were clearly valued for their experience and ability to navigate the complexities of government. They were the ultimate insiders.
Sounds like they were the go-to problem solvers, the ones presidents relied on no matter their political party.
Exactly. It suggests a level of respect that transcends partisan politics, which is pretty rare these days.
It definitely speaks to their ability to build relationships and navigate that political landscape. But it also raises some questions.
Like what?
Well, like, does this constant reshuffling of cabinet members, even across different administrations, contribute to a sense of continuity in governance? Or does it create a situation where these individuals become so entrenched that they're almost untouchable, regardless of their performance?
It's like a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, you've got experienced people who can provide stability and institutional knowledge, but on the other hand, if they're not held accountable, it could lead to complacency or even worse.
Right. Got to find that balance.
Exactly. And it's important to note that not everyone fits neatly into these four ambition categories. Some individuals take a slightly different path after their cabinet roles. Maybe leading government corporations or regulatory bodies, they're still engaged in public service, but they've stepped back from the high-stakes world of the cabinet.
So they're choosing a more focused role, maybe zeroing in on a specific area they're passionate about.
Precisely. It's a different kind of ambition, one driven by a desire to make a difference in a particular field, rather than climbing the ladder of power.
Interesting.
Now, before we dive deeper into the broader implications of all of this, let's take a step back and look at the numbers. The research paper also looked at the tenure lengths for these cabinet secretaries. Anything stand out to you there?
Actually, yeah. What's fascinating is that while most of these individuals served for 1 to 2 years, there were a few notable exceptions. Like, take Leandro Mendoza, for example. He served a remarkable 8 years as DOTC secretary under President Arroyo.
8 years?
8 years. That's practically unheard of for a cabinet position.
It is. What do you think contributed to his longevity in that role?
Honestly, it's hard to say without digging deeper into the specifics. It could have been his skills, his relationship with the president, the political climate at the time. Who knows?
Yeah, it's an outlier that definitely raises some interesting questions. Like, what are the ingredients for success in a cabinet position? How much of it is individual competence versus political savvy?
Lots to unpack there.
There is. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture. How these individual stories connect to this idea of civil-military relations in the Philippines.
That's a good segue, because what we're seeing here through these individual career trajectories is a reflection of a bigger trend, you know?
What do you mean?
Well, a shift in how the military is perceived and utilized within the Philippine government. The research paper uses these terms, old professionalism and new professionalism, to describe this evolution.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What are these professionalisms all about?
Okay, so think of old professionalism as the traditional model. It emphasizes a clear separation between the military and domestic politics. The military's primary role is national defense, protecting the country from external threats. They're meant to stay in their lane, so to speak.
So it's about maintaining a clear line between those who protect the country and those who govern it.
Right, like those who wield the sword shouldn't meddle in politics, kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense, but then what's this new professionalism all about? How's it different?
Well, with new professionalism, you see the military taking on a more expansive role, becoming involved in areas that traditionally fall under the purview of civilian institutions.
Like what kind of areas?
We're talking internal security, disaster response, infrastructure development. even social welfare programs.
So instead of just focusing on external threats, they're becoming more involved in the day-to-day workings of the government.
Exactly. It's a more integrated approach to security and governance.
I see. So what's driving this shift? Why are governments increasingly turning to their militaries to handle these tasks?
Well, there's a few factors at play. Globalization, for one, has created a whole new set of security challenges that demand a broader approach. Transnational terrorism, cyber threats, the instability caused by climate change.
Right. These aren't issues that can be neatly contained within national borders. They require a more interconnected response.
Exactly. And in many cases, governments see their militaries as the best equipped to handle these complex challenges. They have the organizational capacity, the discipline, the expertise in logistics and planning, all qualities that can be valuable in tackling these new threats.
So it's not just about like a power grab or an ideological shift. It's also about pragmatism and trying to find the most effective solutions to these new global problems.
That's a key point.
It's like saying, hey, we've got this highly trained and disciplined force with
Yeah.
experience in logistics, planning, and execution. Why not utilize their skills to tackle a wider range of problems?
Exactly.
Okay, but I imagine there are some concerns about the military becoming too involved in civilian affairs and potentially undermining democratic principle.
Oh, absolutely. It's a delicate balance for sure.
And it sounds like the Philippines is right in the middle of this transition between old and new professionalism.
That's exactly what the research paper concludes. It paints a picture of a country grappling with how best to utilize its military in a rapidly changing world.
And it's so interesting to see how these individual career paths we've been discussing fit into this larger narrative. They're like pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, reveal this complex and evolving picture of civil-military relations in the Philippines.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Oh, before we move on, there's one more interesting tidbit from the research I want to touch on. They found that only a small percentage of these cabinet secretaries, just 7 out of the 32, were reappointed to another department after their initial appointment. And what's even more interesting is that most of these reappointments happened during the Arroyo administration.
Really?
Yeah, makes you wonder what was going on during that time period. That led to more reshuffling and reappointments within the cabinet, especially for those with military and police backgrounds.
Was it a deliberate strategy, or were there specific circumstances that led to those moves?
It's a question worth exploring. But for now, I think it's important to highlight that all of this research is based on publicly accessible records, which adds a layer of credibility to the findings. We're not dealing with speculation here. This is solid data analysis that paints a fascinating picture of this trend in the Philippines.
Right, it's good to have that solid foundation of data.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored these fascinating career trajectories, gotten a glimpse into the motivations behind them, and started to connect those individual stories to the broader context of civil-military relations in the Philippines.
It's been an insightful journey so far.
It has, but there's so much more to uncover. So buckle up, because in the next part, we're going to dive even deeper into the implications of this trend, explore whether it's happening in other parts of the world, and discuss what it all means for the future of democracy.
Can't wait.
Me neither.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this fascinating world of retired but not tired military and police officers in the Philippines.
We've been exploring this trend of them moving into these powerful civilian government roles, and the more we learn, the more questions it seems to raise.
It really does.
So remember at the end of part 1, we were talking about how this whole thing might not be unique to the Philippines?
Right, we were wondering if there's maybe a global shift happening towards this new professionalism.
Yeah, like are we seeing this blurring of lines between military and civilian spheres happening in other parts of the world too?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Is it a global phenomenon?
It is. So what's the answer?
It's complicated. It's not a simple yes or no.
I figured as much.
Yeah, every country has its own unique history, culture, and political context, right?
Right, so there's no one size fits all.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But having said that, there are some common threads we can look at. So for one thing, that line between military and civilian spheres, it's always been a bit blurry, especially in developing nations.
You mean it's not like there's this perfect division everywhere?
Right. If you look back historically, in lots of countries, the military has been called upon to do more than just traditional defense.
Like what?
Well, things like disaster relief or big infrastructure projects, even stepping in to keep order during times of crisis.
So this new professionalism isn't totally brand new. It's kind of like an evolution of what's already been happening.
Exactly. It's building on that existing foundation. But I think what we're seeing now in some parts of the world is a more deliberate and faster shift towards this model.
Interesting. Okay, so what's making it accelerate? Why are governments using their militaries more and more for things that civilians used to handle?
There's a few reasons. Globalization is a big one. It's created a whole new set of security challenges.
Yeah, I can see that.
Think about terrorism that crosses borders, cyber attacks, instability from climate change.
These aren't things you can just contain within one country.
Right. You need a much broader approach, more cooperation. And sometimes governments see their militaries as the best equipped to handle those really complicated situations.
They've got the structure, the discipline, experience with logistics and planning.
Exactly. All those things are valuable when you're facing these new threats.
So it's not always about a power grab then.
No, not always.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just about practicality.
Right, like who's the best tool for the job?
Exactly. But there's another side to this, of course. We can't ignore what's happening with the rise of populism and strongman leaders around the world.
True.
Those leaders often see the military as a source of stability and loyalty, a force they can rely on to get things done, you know?
To get around the bureaucracy.
Exactly. So in those cases, it might not be about new professionalism so much as consolidating power.
That makes sense.
And that's something to be wary of.
Oh, absolutely.
When the military gets too involved in politics, it can really damage those democratic norms and weaken those checks and balances we need.
Big time. And that brings us back to the Philippines. We've been looking at how this integration of military and police officers into the civilian government has worked historically. But what does it all mean for the country's future?
Well, the key takeaway, I think, is that it's complex. There are potential benefits and risks. There's no easy answer.
No black and white, just shades of gray.
Exactly. These individuals bring valuable experience to the table, you know?
Mhm.
Leadership, discipline, they've handled crises, they can be really effective at getting things done.
Especially when things are tough.
Right. But on the other hand, we have to consider the concerns about accountability and transparency, and whether the military might be overstepping its boundaries.
It's all about finding that balance, making sure their involvement in civilian affairs doesn't damage those democratic processes.
Exactly. So the question is, how do we navigate this tricky situation? What should we be looking out for as this integration continues?
Yeah, what are the red flags?
Well, one thing to keep an eye on is the impact on civilian institutions. When you have all these former military officers coming in, it can create some clashes.
I bet. They might have very different leadership styles and ways of making decisions.
Exactly. And there's a risk that the expertise of civilian professionals gets overlooked.
So it's not just about the individuals, it's about how the whole system functions.
Right. Another big thing to watch is public perception and trust. If people start to feel like the military has too much power in the government.
It could breed mistrust.
Exactly. That's when you start to worry about things being done behind closed doors.
So transparency is crucial.
More than ever. And that means being open about things like military budgets, procurement, let the public see what's happening.
Let the sun shine in.
Right. And we should be encouraging open discussions about security challenges and the role of the military. Public forums, media engagement, even bring it into schools.
Wow. So it's about moving beyond that need-to-know mindset, making sure people understand the issues.
That's the idea. When people are informed, they can participate in the decisions and hold their leaders accountable.
That makes sense. But how do you actually put these changes into practice? It sounds like a huge task.
It is, no doubt. You need political will, cooperation from different groups, and a long-term commitment to change. It's not a quick fix.
A marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
Mm.
And it needs the involvement of civil society, academics, journalists, and especially everyday citizens.
Everyone doing their part.
Yes. Working together to build a system that truly works for the people. Now, I want to circle back to something I said earlier about this integration not always being a bad thing.
Oh, right.
There are definitely benefits to using the military's expertise in certain situations.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Right. Using their skills strategically while still protecting those democratic principles.
So it's not about saying the military should never be involved. It's about making sure the right safeguards are in place.
Exactly. Civilian control, transparency, accountability, those things have to come first.
It's about making sure they're serving the people, not the other way around.
Well put. And ultimately, that's what matters most.
Now, speaking of things that matter, before we wrap up this part, can we tie all of this back to those four ambition types we were talking about?
From Schlesinger's theory.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you think those categories might tell us something about how this trend could play out?
I think that's a great idea. Let's see if we can connect those dots. So first, discrete ambition, the folks who are happy with one term, and then they're out.
Right. They're not looking to build a dynasty.
Exactly. They might be less likely to want to establish long-term military influence in the government. They're focused on that one job, and then they move on.
So they're less likely to be thinking about the long game.
Possibly, yeah. But of course, it always depends on the individual and the circumstances. There are always exceptions.
People can surprise you.
They can. Okay, what about static ambition? The ones who stick around at the cabinet level, sometimes moving between departments?
They're the institutional veterans.
Right. Their presence in government could make it seem more normal to have military and police officers in those civilian roles.
Like they become familiar faces, part of the establishment.
Exactly. And that can be good or bad, depending on how they use their influence.
If they're open to civilian expertise, it could work well.
Right. Now think about progressive ambition. The ones who want to climb higher after their cabinet job.
Those are the ones with their eyes on the prize.
Right. If they're successful, it could encourage other military and police officers to go for those civilian leadership roles.
Because they see it as a path to the top.
Exactly. And if they manage to change policies or institutions to favor the military, that could have a lasting impact.
Yeah, that could shift the whole balance.
It could. Okay, last one. Intrainstitutional ambition. The ones who are aiming for powerful positions within the government, but not necessarily higher office.
The behind-the-scenes players, right.
They can have a lot of influence, especially if they're in positions that let them control resources or make appointments.
They might not be in the spotlight, but they're definitely calling some of the shots.
Exactly. And the important thing to remember is that these ambition categories aren't set in stone. Someone might start with one, then shift to another as their career develops.
So it's fluid, always changing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's something we need to keep studying. There's so much more to learn.
I agree. This has been an incredible conversation. We've uncovered a lot, but I feel like there's still so much more to discuss.
Me too.
Okay, so before we jump into the final part of our deep dive, I think we need a moment to process all of this. We'll be back in a flash to wrap things up. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this whole trend of retired military and police officers moving into civilian government roles. We've looked at specific examples, global trends, and even talked about some of the risks involved.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey.
It has. But now I'm wondering, what can we actually do about all of this? Like, if this integration of the military into civilian government is something we should be concerned about, what are the solutions? How do we balance the good with the bad?
Well, as with most complex issues, there's no magic bullet, unfortunately.
Figured.
But there are definitely some steps we can take to address the concerns.
Okay, I'm listening.
First and foremost, we need to strengthen those civilian institutions.
Okay, that makes sense.
We were just talking about how an influx of former military officers can create those clashes and sometimes push aside civilian expertise.
Right, they come from different worlds.
Exactly. So bolstering those civilian institutions is crucial.
But how do we actually do that?
Well, it takes a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
One thing we can do is invest in training programs specifically for civilian government officials.
So give them the tools and knowledge they need.
Right. Equip them to navigate the complexities of government and lead effectively in those environments.
So it's about making sure they're on a level playing field, so to speak.
Exactly. It's about capacity building.
Okay, what else?
We also need to foster a real culture of respect for civilian expertise within the government.
So it's not just about skills, it's about attitudes, too.
It is. And that has to start from the top,
Leadership needs to set the tone.
They do. They need to make it crystal clear that civilian voices are not just welcome, they're absolutely vital to the process.
That makes sense.
Alongside all that, we can't forget about those checks and balances we talked about.
Right, the oversight mechanisms.
Exactly. They need to be robust and effective.
Okay, but how do we make sure that actually happens?
Well, for one thing, those parliamentary committees responsible for defense and security, they need to have the resources and the expertise to really scrutinize what the military is doing.
So no rubber stamping, they need to be able to dig deep.
Exactly. They need to ask tough questions and hold the military accountable.
I like it.
And another important step is to create independent bodies that can investigate any allegations of human rights abuses or misconduct by the military.
So an extra layer of accountability.
Right. It ensures that these sensitive issues are handled fairly and thoroughly.
Makes sense. No one should be above the law.
Exactly. And speaking of transparency, we need to involve the public more in matters of security and defense.
Okay, I agree with that, but how do we get the public more engaged in such complex issues?
Well, we can start by being more open about the military budget, how they're spending money.
Open the books.
Right. When that information is public, it allows for greater scrutiny and helps prevent corruption.
Shining that light on the process. Good.
Exactly. And we also need to encourage more open dialogue and debate about security challenges.
Get people talking.
Yes. Public forums, media engagement, maybe even include these topics in school curriculums.
So we're moving away from that need-to-know mentality.
Exactly. We need a more informed and engaged citizenry.
Because when people understand the issues, they can participate in the decisions and hold their leaders accountable. This all sounds great in theory, but I'm wondering about the practical side. How do we make all of these changes happen? It seems like a really daunting task.
It is a big undertaking, you're right, but it's not impossible.
Okay, good.
It takes political will, collaboration, and a commitment to change over the long haul.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And everyone needs to play their part. Civil society organizations, academics, journalists, everyday citizens.
Working together toward a common goal.
Yes, to create a system that truly serves the needs of the people.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You said this trend toward greater integration of the military isn't always a bad thing.
Right, we don't want to demonize the military or suggest they have no role to play.
Right, because they do have valuable expertise.
They do. It's about finding that sweet spot, using their skills effectively while protecting democratic principles.
It's about striking that balance, making sure civilian control and accountability don't get lost in the process.
Exactly. It's about harnessing their capabilities for the greater good, but always remembering that civilian oversight is essential.
It's about finding that harmony between the military and civilian spheres.
Well said. It's about making sure the military serves the people, not the other way around.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And that's really what it all boils down to.
Well, I think we've really dug deep into this topic, explored the nuances, the challenges, the potential solutions.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we sign off?
Just this. Keep your eyes open. This trend is happening all over the world, and it has big implications for the future of democracy. Stay informed, ask questions, speak up.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more. Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep those conversations going.